My name is Gabriella Carolini. I'm an assistant professor in the International Development Group here at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. I'm also affiliated with the Housing, Community and Economic Development Group and the Environmental Policy and Planning groups. More widely, I've served as a senior associate to the UN Millennium Task Force on Slums, which was was an initiative of the Millennium Development Goals, which is now, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. I've worked with the Rockefeller Foundation to help build an urban summit of global thought leaders and practitioners, particularly from the Global South. I've also worked more closely within the Institute on a task force on Africa, which basically aims to facilitate our engagement with research and scholars on the continent, but also to create an intellectual home and a space here at MIT for the research that we do on the ground across many countries on the continent. Most closely to home, within the department, I work with a student initiative called Urban Africa. For my own research and teaching, I focus on basically what I would call the dynamic relationship between fiscal and social responsibilities, i.e. how our fiscal reforms, public administration reforms impacting basic services and infrastructure development, and with a special eye to the impact on marginalized communities in cities within the Global South. I have a particular interest in South-South cooperation between what I would call proximate peers, again, in the water and sanitation sector and also within budgeting and accounting. Anything in the public sector is by necessity political. I think historically, if you look at the professionalization of accounting and budgeting, for example, here in the United States, the hope was always that these would be technical exercises that were separated from political interference or corruption. But the truth is that there's been a wealth of scholarship over decades now that shows both the implicit and explicit ways in which these exercises within fiscal policy are very much political and very often politicized. For example, no one would argue that the budget sequestration here in the United States in 2013 was anything that was not politicized or political. In my own work, what I've done is examine the ways that even international public sector accounting standards are very much political and politicized in that they reflect the ideologies, the values, and perspectives of high-income countries on what fiscal responsibility is. And while that might be functionally a good thing, in practice it really ignores the interests and needs of lower income countries that are struggling with different sorts of budgeting and accounting problems, namely, for example, how to account for investments in and productivity in the informal sector, be that the informal housing sector, be that in informal labor markets or in even manufacturing. Planners are often imagining or envisioning the city that should be. So in planning, we move from that which is to that which ought to be. But you can't get to that which ought to be without realizing how budgeting constraints and how financial accounting practices actually delimit what one can actually do from the public sector perspective. When a planner or a planning student walks into an office and says, this is a master plan, this is what we want to see happen, and the agency or the body that is in control of the financial purse of a particular level of government says, we don't have the money for it. What I hope is that our students will be prepared enough with the financial language and terminology and practices to understand how to argue out for their plans, how to argue out for their visions. Because if you don't know how to speak that language, you can't be in the game. You can't really see the realization of the urban visions.